On September 10, 1898, an assassin stabbed Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known across Europe as Sisi, with a homemade sharpened file so precisely that she didn't even realize she had been attacked. She stood up, insisted she was fine, and walked onto a boat. She was dead within the hour. Her killer hadn't spent weeks studying her. He hadn't even planned to kill her at all until a few hours before he did it. This is the true story of one of history's strangest and most senseless royal assassinations. Elizabeth of Austria was, by 1898, one of the most famous women in Europe, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, married to Emperor Franz Joseph I since the age of 16. She was renowned for her beauty and her almost obsessive devotion to preserving it, a punishing beauty regimen, extreme diets, hours of daily exercise, and a corset laced so tight it could take nearly an hour to fit her into it. But by the late 1890s, the woman behind the famous portraits was somewhere else entirely. In 1889, her only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, had died in an apparent murder-suicide at Meierling with his mistress. A scandal and a grief so total that Elizabeth wore black mourning clothes for the rest of her life and largely withdrew from public duties. She spent her final years almost constantly traveling, often incognito, moving from city to city under a false name to avoid the crowds and formality that came with being recognized as an empress. In September 1898, she arrived in Geneva, Switzerland, registered at the Hotel Beau Rivage under the alias Countess of Hohenems, accompanied only by her lady-in-waiting, Countess Irma Starai. She had spent years successfully disappearing into anonymity. It wouldn't save her. 25-year-old Luigi Luciani was an Italian anarchist living in Switzerland, caught up in a violent political movement that believed in what its followers called propaganda of the deed, the idea that assassinating any prominent aristocrat, almost regardless of who specifically they were, would strike a symbolic blow against monarchy itself and inspire revolution. Luciani's actual target that week was Prince Henri Philippe of Orléans, a French royal he'd heard was visiting the region. He couldn't find him. The prince had already left. Rather than abandon the plan, Luciani picked up a local newspaper and read that Empress Elisabeth of Austria was currently staying in Geneva under a thin disguise everyone in high society already recognized. To Luciani, one royal target was as good as another. He decided, with almost no additional planning, that she would do instead. He couldn't afford a proper weapon. Instead, Luciani bought a small handle and fitted it to a sharpened shoemaker's needle file, a crude, narrow, 4-inch blade meant for filing wood or leather, now turned into an improvised dagger. It was cheap, easy to conceal, and, as it turned out, more than sharp enough. He waited near the lakeside, watching for her. On the afternoon of September 10, 1898, Elizabeth and Countess Starai left the Hotel Beau Rivage on foot, walking toward the lake to board a steamer to Montreux. As they passed along the promenade, Luigi Luciani rushed directly at the Empress, appeared to stumble into her, and drove the sharpened file into her chest with enough force that it pierced her heart, then pulled it free and fled before anyone understood what had happened. Elizabeth fell to the ground. She got back up almost immediately. The wound was so small and so precisely placed that she felt only a sharp blow, not a stabbing. She assumed a stranger had simply punched her in the chest. Her famously tight corset, laced for her beauty regimen, was pressed so firmly against her body that it acted almost like a bandage, holding the tiny wound closed and limiting the external bleeding almost entirely. She insisted she was fine. She continued walking. She boarded the steamer. Minutes into the crossing, Empress Elisabeth of Austria collapsed on the deck of the boat. Countess Starai rushed to her side and in a panic loosened the Empress's tightly laced bodice to help her breathe, and only then noticed a small dark blood stain spreading through the fabric. The boat turned immediately back toward the hotel. Elizabeth was carried to her room, already unconscious. She died within the hour, without regaining consciousness. The internal bleeding from a wound barely visible from the outside had been enough, once her heart's protective lining finally gave way, to kill her almost silently. Luigi Lucchini didn't get far. He was caught by bystanders in the street within minutes of the attack and handed over to police. Under interrogation, he showed no remorse at all. He openly admitted he had chosen his target essentially at random once his original plan fell through, and stated plainly that he would have killed any royal figure he could reach. He reportedly wanted to be sentenced to death, believing it would make him a martyr for the anarchist cause. Geneva had abolished capital punishment years earlier. He was sentenced to life imprisonment instead. For Emperor Franz Joseph I, it was one more loss in a life already defined by them. His brother Maximilian executed by firing squad in Mexico decades earlier, his son Rudolf dead at Meierling, and now his wife, killed by a stranger who barely knew her name. Luigi Lucchini spent 12 years in a Geneva prison cell, never expressing regret for what he'd done. On October 19, 1910, he hanged himself using his own belt. Empress Elisabeth had spent the final decade of her life trying to disappear, traveling under false names, avoiding crowds, retreating from the public role she'd never really wanted. She was killed in public anyway, by a man who hadn't even meant to target her specifically, using a sharpened tool that cost him almost nothing. They stabbed Empress Sisi, and for nearly 90 minutes, she didn't even know it had happened. One of the most photographed, most recognized women in 19th century Europe died from a wound so quiet she initially mistook it for a punch. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.